The Joe and LAURIE DINE Award for Human Rights, sponsored by their son Philip DINE, goes to a young writer, Sarah Stillman, for her New Yorker article, The Invisible Army, about serious labor abuses on American military bases in war zones. Sarah?
Thank you. Thanks. So this story began for me when I was at an Indian restaurant in Oxford, England. And I had this Indian waiter named Tony who came up to me. He heard my American accent and he said, "You're an American? Oh my God, I used to work on a US military base in Baghdad. And you have to check out my cell phone photos of me with Jessica Simpson, who was there on her USO tour performing in Baghdad in a little halter top. So it wasn't quite Miss Indonesia, but he flips through these photos and he had these really amusing stories about working on a US military base, feeding soldiers in a dining facility. But then he started telling me stories of his friends, many of whom had been promised great jobs in Dubai, working in hotels, and instead were taken to military bases to do logistics work. And this is something I'd never heard about. I had no idea that we were piping in tens of thousands of workers from Uganda and India and Bangladesh to do the service work on military bases. So when I went to Iraq for the first time in 2008 to work on another story. And I thought, this was on my radar screen now. I wanted to explore. And I thought I would have to really dig to find stories of the sort that Tony had been telling me in that restaurant. And instead what I found is, as soon as I walked off the plane, one of the first things I saw was a Pizza Hut staffed by Indians. And one of the second things I saw was a Cinnabon staffed by Bangladeshis. One of the third things I saw was a beauty salon where you could get a pedicure or manicure for $7 from a Fijian woman. So that struck me as a story in and of itself. But as I began to speak to workers on 6 different US military bases across Iraq, I found that almost every one of them had a remarkable story and often a horrific story of what had brought them there, often deceptive recruiting practices, being promised a great job in one place and instead being taken to a military base where they were often making 1/5 of the wages they'd been promised and where they were often subject to pretty grave abuses. So the focus of the piece became these Fijian beauticians who had been promised luxury jobs in Dubai and instead were taken to a base where they faced sexual assault, where they faced wages that were 1/10 of what they'd been promised. And where I found workers who rioted because they were not receiving enough food, 1,500 workers smashing facilities on the largest US military base in Baghdad. So I came back thinking I'd found, what more could I have hoped for? I found exactly what I was looking for and started looking for an editor. I was a freelancer at that point with no contract. And I found the story was a lot harder to sell than I imagined it would be. I was told by the first editor I took it to, if you could repitch this to me and tell me, in the Hollywood movie version, who would Julia Roberts play, then I would consider it. So instead I went to the bathroom and wrote that down in a little notebook and said, maybe someday I'll get to tell that to a friend and not cry. And instead I found the best editor I could have ever hoped for in the world, an editor who was willing to take a chance on me, Henry Finder, who's here tonight at the New Yorker. Because at that point I sat down and I said, I'm young and untested and I've just got to write the story and hope to sell it that way. So Henry was kind enough to work his magic on it, and the women were brave enough to risk a lot to share their stories with me, as were a lot of other workers. So I'm grateful to them and grateful to all of you tonight. Thanks.